Grimora.
The lake always looked different at night. During the day, Whisper Lake was a calm sheet of glass, reflecting the tall pines and the gray sky of northern Minnesota. But at night, the surface darkened into something that felt alive, as if it swallowed sound and breathed out coldness. When I first arrived in the small town Lakeside, I didn't understand why the locals avoided the water after sunset. I thought it was superstition, maybe old stories, passed around more for tradition than truth. But during my first week living there, I began to understand that Whisper Lake had a presence of its own. I had taken a short-term job cataloging wildlife activity for a research grant, renting an old cabin 30 feet from the shore. The owner, an elderly man named Robert, arrived with the key and a warning. He didn't smile. He didn't joke. He spoke the way someone does when they're repeating something they've said 100 times, hoping it would finally sink in. He told me not to go outside after midnight. He told me to close the curtains before dark and not to respond to any voices I heard near the lake. I tried to laugh lightly as he said this, but his face stayed hollow. I realized he wasn't performing. He wasn't trying to scare me. He was tired. On my first night there, I followed his rules out of respect, but by the second night, the isolation started to get to me. It was so quiet that even my own breathing felt loud. Pine branches scraped against the cabin's metal roof. The wind rolled across the water like something heavy dragging itself to shore. I tried to write in my notebook, but every sound demanded my attention. Around 11:30 p.m., I stepped outside, ignoring my own hesitation. The cold stung my face instantly, and the air smelled like frozen earth and wet timber. The moon hung low, reflecting off the lake's surface. It was beautiful in a haunting way, and that was when I noticed the mist, dense, moving low, curling like fingers above the water. The lake wasn't calm tonight. The surface quivered in irregular patterns, as if something beneath it shifted. I squinted into the white haze drifting across the water and saw shapes forming, breaking apart, reforming again. My mind tried to turn them into branches or fog patches, but the way they moved, they seemed too deliberate. I stayed there, frozen, watching the lake breathe. That was when I heard the first sound. It wasn't a voice, not exactly, more like a long exhale, a sigh, traveling across the water, soft, drawn out, impossible to place. I tried to convince myself it was the wind, but the air around me was still. When I went inside and locked the door, I felt the pressure in my chest ease. I turned off the lights, sat on the couch, and tried to sleep, but that sigh echoed in my head long after. The next morning, I woke early and walked toward the lake with my camera. The fog was gone. The water looked completely normal, but that was what made me uneasy. The difference between day and night felt unnatural, as if the lake lived two totally separate existences, depending on the hour. On the third night, something changed. It was a little past midnight. I had just turned off the lights when I heard footsteps outside, soft at first, crunching against the frosted ground, slow, steady, moving toward the cabin from the direction of the lake. My body went tense. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The footsteps stopped right outside the front door. I waited for a knock. It never came. Instead, I heard a sound I will never forget. It was the sound of dripping water, as if someone stood on my porch, soaked to the bone, water falling from their clothes and pooling on the wooden boards. The air drained from my lungs. Very gently, I stepped closer to the door. I didn't dare look through the peephole. Something in me said I wasn't supposed to see who, no, what was standing on the other side. A wet breath pressed against the door. A slow inhale, a slow exhale. So close, I could feel the vibration of it through the wood. My hands shook violently. I took 2 steps back, unable to tear my gaze away from the doorframe, convinced something would push through it. Minutes passed, or maybe it was seconds. When the dripping finally stopped, silence spread so thick it felt like cotton stuffed into my ears. After a while, I built enough courage to look outside from the window next to the door, pulling the curtain just a half-inch. At first, I saw nothing, just pine trees and darkness. But then I noticed the wooden boards on the porch glistening under the moonlight, fresh footprints, soaked and unmistakably human, bare feet, small, almost delicate. Each print perfectly formed in a trail leading back toward the lake. And the moment I traced them all the way toward the shoreline, I saw her, only for a second, only long enough for me to question if I truly saw her. A woman standing ankle deep in the freezing water, her hair long and dripping, her clothing clinging tightly to her thin frame. Her head hung low, her body still, facing the cabin. When I blinked, she was gone. I slammed the curtain shut and backed away from the window. My heart hammered inside my chest. I wanted to leave, but something in the air pressed against me, rooting me to the cabin floor. I didn't sleep that night, not even for a moment. By morning, the footprints were still on the porch, but they were frozen solid, as if whatever had walked there wasn't warm enough to melt the frost, only to wet it. I needed answers. The locals had to know something, so I drove into town, gripping the steering wheel harder than necessary, running the image of that drowned woman over and over in my mind. Inside the only diner open that early, I approached a middle-aged waitress with silver hair and tired eyes. She looked at me like she already knew why I was there. Before I could speak, she simply shook her head. "You're staying at the lakeside cabin, aren't you?" she whispered. I nodded slowly. She set down her coffee pot. Her hands shook. "You saw her," she said. I didn't respond. I didn't have to. She leaned closer, her voice trembling. "She doesn't come out for just anyone." The waitress didn't pour my coffee again. She simply stood there, her hand fixed around the handle of the pot, eyes locked on mine as if searching for confirmation of something she wished wasn't true. I didn't know what to say. The town felt small enough that everyone knew everything, yet no one wanted to speak about the lake. She finally broke the silence. "You need to leave that cabin," she whispered. "Tonight, if you can." I felt a strange defensiveness rise inside me, a mixture of disbelief and irritation. I wasn't the type to run because of whispers or old legends. Still, the memory of the footprints freezing over the porch, the dripping sound, the breath through the door, clung to my thoughts like frostbite. I asked her what exactly I had seen. She hesitated, her lips pressed together. "She drowned," the waitress said, "years ago, but her body was never recovered. Folks say she never left that lake. Some nights she comes ashore looking for—" She trailed off, staring through the diner window as if the lake sat right outside. "Looking for what?" I pressed. The woman swallowed hard. "Her family," A chill slid down my spine. I wanted to ask more, but she stepped back with a sudden firmness, as though she'd already said too much. "You won't get anyone here to talk," she said. "That lake swallowed too much of this town. Please, just go." When she walked away, I stayed seated, processing her words. I didn't want to believe them, but something in her voice felt honest, terrified even. My breakfast sat untouched. I drove back to the cabin with a heaviness pressing on the wheel. The pines seemed darker, leaning inward as the road narrowed. Back at the cabin, the footprints on the porch still glistened. The sun had warmed the boards, but the frozen marks hadn't melted. They remained etched as deep frost impressions, locked in place like the memory of something that didn't belong in daylight. That afternoon, I forced myself to focus on work, anything to anchor my thoughts to something rational. I set up trail cameras deeper in the woods, collected soil samples, and tried to lose myself in routine. But the trees felt too quiet. No birdsong, no rustling underbrush. Even the wind seemed reluctant to pass through. I kept glancing back toward the water, knowing she was out there somewhere, whether I saw her or not. By the time the sun began to drop behind the tree line, an uneasiness crept beneath my skin. I didn't want to be outside when darkness fully settled. So I returned to the cabin early, locked the door, and pulled all the curtains tight. I tried to read. I tried to distract myself, but my mind kept circling back to the diner woman's voice. She doesn't come out for just anyone. The clock ticked past 11 p.m., then midnight. I sat on the couch with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, eyes fixed on the front door, even though I knew I shouldn't stare at it. Every small creak, every gust of wind against the cabin walls made me tense. Around 12:40 a.m., the cabin temperature dropped so fast I could see my breath. The heater was running. It shouldn't have been cold enough for that. My chest tightened. I felt the same pressure I had felt the first night, like the house was holding its breath with me. Then I heard it. The dripping again. Soft first, then heavier. Right outside the door. This time I didn't move backward. I didn't freeze. I walked to the small side window, keeping the curtain closed except for a tiny opening. My hands shook uncontrollably. My pulse hammered in my ears, but I forced myself to look. She was there. Not on the porch, not at the door. She stood at the edge of the water, facing the cabin as if waiting for me. Her hair was tangled, heavy with freezing water that dripped in long strings. Her dress clung to her like thin ice. Even from a distance, her skin looked almost translucent, as if whatever warmth she once had drained into the lake long ago. She lifted her head. I stepped backward instinctively, but I couldn't stop watching. Her face was ruined by water. Cheeks hollowed, lips blue, eyes dark and unfocused, like someone trapped underwater. She lifted her arm slowly, pointing toward the cabin, not beckoning, not threatening, more like she was accusing. A sound rose from the lake, deep and resonant, like something shifting below the surface. Ripples formed around her feet, even though she didn't move. The water grew darker, twisting in patterns that looked too deliberate to be natural. I stumbled back from the window, my breath breaking. I didn't know what she wanted, but her gaze, those bottomless, water-filled eyes, stayed in my mind long after I dropped onto the couch, gripping the blanket like a lifeline. The air felt thick, almost unbreathable, until the dripping sound finally stopped. The silence that followed was worse. When morning came, I forced myself outside. The lake was calm. No footprints, no wet marks on the porch, but something new waited for me. Something I had missed the first night. A single line of small prints leading away from the water. They were faint, almost erased by sunlight, but unmistakably real. And they didn't belong to the woman. They were smaller, a child's prints. I followed them with growing dread. They stopped halfway across the clearing, vanishing abruptly, as if whatever made them simply dissolved into the air. I crouched down, tracing the indentations with trembling fingers. They were newly formed, maybe only hours old. My throat tightened. 2 sets of footprints, one adult, one child. The waitress said the woman drowned with her family. As I stood there staring at those tiny frozen impressions in the earth, the woods behind me rustled. Not with wind, not with animals, but with something moving deliberately, deeper between the pines. Something slow, something cautious, something watching. I turned, heart pounding, but saw no other trees. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something stood between them, just beyond sight, waiting for me to come closer. That night would bring answers I wasn't prepared for.
I stayed outside longer than I should have, staring at the tree line where the sound had come from. The morning light did nothing to settle my nerves. If anything, the sunlight only made the woods seem deeper, darker, filled with places where something could hide unseen. I kept replaying the tiny footprints in my mind. The adult prints on my porch were disturbing enough, but the thought of a child walking out of that freezing lake, that twisted something inside me I couldn't ignore. By afternoon, I felt trapped. The cabin felt smaller. Every window felt like an eye. I tried calling the research office to ask for permission to relocate, but the call wouldn't connect. The signal here was always weak, but today it was completely dead. My phone couldn't even load a text message. I wasn't sure if it was the weather or something else. As daylight faded, every sound started to feel like an omen. Pine needles pattering against the roof sounded like fingers tapping. The wind sliding under the cabin's foundation sounded like someone whispering beneath the floorboards. I made tea just to keep my hands occupied. The steam rising from the mug felt warmer than anything else in the room. When it got dark, I closed all the curtains before the lake shadows reached the yard. I could still feel its presence behind the fabric, the stillness of the water pressing silently toward the cabin. By midnight, the temperature fell again, suddenly, sharply, like someone had opened a door to winter. Then came the footsteps. This time, they didn't start at the lake. They began behind the cabin, moving through dead leaves and frost-covered ground. Slow, shuffling, dragging footsteps. They circled the cabin once, then twice. On the third pass, they stopped under the side window. I didn't look. I couldn't. My breath fogged in front of me, even though I wasn't near the glass. It was colder inside the cabin than outside, an unnatural cold, like something drained the heat straight from the walls. Then I heard another sound, high, soft, barely audible, a child humming. My blood froze. It wasn't a tune I recognized, just a slow, uneasy melody, rising and falling in a pattern that didn't belong in the mouth of anything alive. The humming moved from the side window to the back of the cabin, then to the front door. 3 small knocks followed. Not loud, not forceful, just soft taps, as if a small hand wanted to be let inside. I backed away, gripping the edge of the table to steady myself. I wanted to shout for it to stop, but my voice locked in my throat. The knocking stopped on its own, followed by silence, so thick it swallowed the air. A minute passed, maybe 2. Then the low, wet exhale returned, closer than ever, right outside the door. I took 1 step back, then another. The doorknob turned, just slightly, just enough to click. I nearly screamed, but the door didn't open. Whatever was out there didn't push. It just tested the lock. The knob slowly rotated back into place, and the footsteps retreated. They moved toward the lake again, 2 sets of them now, 1 heavy, 1 light. When the sound faded, I collapsed onto the couch, my chest heaving. I didn't sleep at all. I waited for dawn like it was the only thing keeping me alive. When sunlight finally crept across the floorboards, I got up, exhausted and trembling. I opened the door slowly, afraid of what I'd find, but the porch was clear. No footprints, no melted patches, no frost, but something new waited just outside. A small object rested on the wooden step. A toy, a tiny water-swollen wooden horse, its paint chipped away, its edges eroded. As soon as I touched it, water dripped from its cracks like it had just been pulled from the bottom of the lake. I dropped it immediately and stumbled backward into the cabin. My pulse erupted in my ears. I didn't want to touch it again. I didn't even want it near me. I grabbed a towel and wrapped it, then placed it on the table, staring at it like it might move on its own. My mind kept racing back to the waitress's words. The woman drowned with her family. If that toy belonged to her child, then something far worse lingered beneath Whisper Lake than just 1 lost spirit. I needed answers. Real answers, not small-town fear or fragments of gossip. So, after pacing the cabin for nearly an hour, I grabbed my jacket and drove back into town. The diner was empty when I entered. The same waitress stood behind the counter, drying glasses with trembling hands. When she saw me, her expression collapsed into dread. "Oh God," she muttered. "It's already started." I set the towel-covered bundle onto the counter. She didn't want to open it, but I lifted the corner of the fabric anyway, revealing the wooden horse. Her face drained of color. "You have to give that back," she whispered. "You should never bring anything from the lake inside your home." "What is going on?" I demanded. "Who is she? Why is she coming to my cabin?" The waitress didn't want to speak, but I refused to leave without an explanation. Finally, she let out a shaking breath and sat down across from me. "She was a mother," she began. "Her name was Marin Hale. She lived here with her husband and their little boy, Toby. They kept to themselves, barely spoke to anyone. One winter, their boat capsized during a storm. They say Marin managed to get her son back onto the overturned hull, but a wave pulled her under before anyone could reach her. Toby died from the cold before rescuers found him, and Marin, she never surfaced." She looked at the wooden horse with pity. "That was his favorite toy," she whispered. My throat tightened. "Why is she coming for me?" She pressed her lips together, her eyes glassy. "Because she thinks you can help her." I stared at her. What does she want? She looked at me then, really looked at me, and the weight of her gaze made my stomach drop. "She wants her son back," she said. I shook my head. "He's gone. He's been gone for years." The waitress nodded slowly. "But she doesn't know that." The diner seemed to grow darker around us. My heartbeat thudded painfully against my ribs. She continued. "She thinks she can find him. Some night she wanders the shoreline calling for him. Other nights, she looks for someone who might lead her to him, someone living, someone she can follow. I felt sick. What happens if she chooses someone? I asked. The waitress swallowed hard, her voice lowering to a trembling whisper. They join her in the lake.
Her words hung in the air like frost, settling into me with a cold I couldn't shake. I stared at the wooden horse on the counter, feeling something inside me tightening, curling into a knot of dread. The waitress didn't look like she was telling an old legend. She looked like someone reliving a nightmare. She said people think the lake is haunted because of her, but it's not just her. The lake keeps things, memories, echoes, sometimes people. My mouth felt dry. Has this happened before? Her eyes closed, as if the memory itself pained her. 7 years ago, a fisherman stayed in the same cabin you're in. He heard voices at night, too. At first, he thought it was the wind. Then he started hearing a child crying outside his door. On the 5th night, the town awoke to screaming. By the time anyone got there, she stopped speaking. I leaned in, my pulse hammering. What happened? They found his boots floating on the lake, but not him. Not a single trace. A chill trickled down my spine. She looked at me with a helpless expression, as if she wished she could offer comfort, but knew nothing she said would matter. You should leave, she repeated. Today, before nightfall. That's the only advice anyone here will give you. I didn't want to argue anymore. Every instinct screamed at me to follow her warning. I grabbed the wrapped toy, nodded, and hurried out of the diner. The cold air slapped my face the moment I stepped outside, but for once I welcomed it. I needed something to ground me. The drive back felt longer than usual. The pines leaned overhead like silent onlookers, their shadows stretching across the road. When I reached the cabin, I didn't go inside immediately. I stood there staring at the lake, the surface calm and deceptively peaceful, sunlight fracturing across it like shards of broken glass. I decided to pack. Inside, I shoved my clothes into the suitcase without folding them. Every minute that passed felt like another minute stolen from me. I grabbed my notebooks, camera, laptop. I unplugged the heater. I worked fast, breathing shallowly, afraid the temperature would drop again, signaling something stirring in the water. But as I zipped the suitcase, a faint knock sounded. Not at the door. From inside the cabin, I froze. The knock came again, softer, near the bedroom wall. 3 taps, then silence. My throat tightened. I moved slowly, each step deliberate, heart pounding louder than my footsteps. When I reached the bedroom, I pressed my ear against the wall. I heard breathing. Not mine, not human. Slow, bubbling breaths that reminded me of someone exhaling underwater. I stumbled backward. The air thickened, turning cold around me. My breath fogged out in front of my face. No, I was leaving. I wasn't staying through another night. I grabbed my suitcase, coat, keys. I reached for the doorknob and stopped. Wet footprints glistened across the floor. Not leading in, leading out. Small footprints, child-sized, starting near the center of the living room, trailing toward the front door as if something had wandered through while I slept, or while I blinked, or while I was busy packing. I followed them with trembling eyes until they reached the door. Then they vanished. A cold wave washed through me. I needed to get out, now. I threw the door open. The entire porch was soaking wet. I stepped back instinctively because standing on the far end of the clearing was the child. A small boy dripping with lake water, clothes clinging to his tiny frame. He didn't move. He just stared at me with wide, unfocused eyes that looked more like darkened marbles than anything alive. His skin was pale, tinged blue. His fingers curled inward as if stiff from cold.
"Toby," I whispered without meaning to. The boy turned his head slowly, as if it were difficult to move. His mouth opened, but no words came out, only a low, watery rattle. He lifted his hand and pointed toward the lake. My legs shook. I wanted to run. I wanted to slam the door and lock myself inside. But something in his expression, something lost, pleading, fragile, held me still. He pointed again, his hand trembling, and then a shape rose from the water. A tall silhouette, shoulders hunched, hair dripping in heavy strands. The surface around her churned unnaturally, as if the lake pulled itself upward to follow her. She stepped forward, water cascading off her in sheets. Her head lifted slowly, her eyes locked on mine. Marin, a cold so sharp it felt like a blade sliced through my chest. She stepped out of the lake, her dress clinging tight, her skin gray and swollen, her movements rigid but purposeful. Toby lowered his arm and turned toward her. For a moment, they just stood there, mother and son, united in death, yet reaching for something neither could grasp. Then she began walking toward the cabin, not fast, not slow, just steady, like she already knew I wouldn't run. The boy followed behind her, his small footsteps leaving wet marks across the frost. I stumbled backward into the cabin, slamming the door shut and locking it twice. My body shook uncontrollably. Their footsteps approached, one heavy, one light, stopping right outside the door. Shadows passed across the curtains. The air grew colder and colder until the room felt like a freezer. Then she spoke. Her voice seeped through the wood like water. "Help me find him." I clamped a hand over my mouth to keep from making a sound. "Bring him back to me." Her tone wasn't angry. It wasn't threatening. It was hollow, aching, the voice of a mother forever trapped in a moment she refused to accept. The child's fingers brushed against the door. Once, twice. I knew then that leaving wasn't going to save me. She wouldn't let me go. Not until I gave her what she wanted. But her son was already dead. The lake already claimed him. There was nothing to bring back. Unless she didn't want me to find her son. She wanted me to replace him. The truth hit me like ice. She wasn't calling for Toby. She was calling for me. The cabin walls creaked under the weight of the cold. The doorknob twitched. And then, just as suddenly as they had come, the footsteps receded. The air warmed. The silence returned. But something new pressed against the back of my mind. A memory I didn't have before. A flash. Marin in the snow, screaming her son's name. The lake roaring around her. A shadow beneath the water, pulling her under. It wasn't just a haunting. It was an invitation. And I knew, with sickening certainty, that tonight she would try again. But this time, she wouldn't knock.
I sat frozen on the floor long after the footsteps faded. My hands shook so violently I had to grip them together just to feel anchored to my own body. The lake outside was quiet again, deceptively still, but the quiet didn't comfort me anymore. It felt like the space between breaths before someone screams. Something inside the cabin had changed. The air felt heavier. My own thoughts felt crowded, as if something else had settled inside my mind without permission. The memory that wasn't mine, that image of Marin drowning, I couldn't shake it. It pulsed behind my eyes like a bruise. The sensation didn't feel like remembering. It felt like someone pressed the memory into me, someone forcing me to carry it for them. I grabbed my coat and suitcase again. I wasn't staying. I didn't care if the sun went down in 20 minutes. I would drive in the dark. I didn't even care if the road out of town iced over. Anything was better than staying here. But when I stepped outside, the world felt
wrong. No wind, no animal sound, no movement. The entire clearing felt held, like the lake was listening. I moved fast, suitcase bumping against my leg, but halfway to the car I stopped. Something caught my eye near the tree line. Small shapes hanging from branches, swaying slightly even though the air was still. I took a step closer. My stomach dropped. Children's toys, dozens of them. Small wooden animals soaked with water, cloth dolls with missing eyes, rusted metal cars, all dangling from twine, as if placed there deliberately, as if someone decorated the trees with lost childhood. The closer I moved, the more I noticed details. Each toy had been weathered with water. Some looked burned at the edges. Some still dripped even under the sun. This wasn't nature. This wasn't the town. This was her. Marin had placed these. Maybe for Toby, maybe for anyone who wandered too close. I turned away quickly, wanting to get back to the car, but a thin, cold voice drifted from the trees. "You will take care of him." I spun around. No one there, but the shadows under the branches looked darker, layered, thick enough to hide anything. My breath stuttered out of me. I backed away slowly until I hit the side of my car. The tires were slashed. Deep, straight cuts across the rubber, all four of them. Ice crystals still clung to the torn edges, as if the damage had been done only moments ago. The air tightened around me. She wasn't waiting for nightfall this time. She wasn't waiting for anything. She was keeping me here. I gripped the car door for balance. My whole body trembled. I forced myself into the driver's seat anyway, slamming the door shut as if thin metal could protect me. I tried turning on the engine even though I knew the car wasn't going anywhere. The engine sputtered, lights flickered, radio crackled with static, then died. I sat in suffocating silence. A ripple crossed the lake, not from wind, not from fish, a single large ripple, as if something massive shifted beneath the surface. I closed my eyes, trying to breathe, trying to plan what to do next. The cabin was the only shelter I had. I didn't want to go back inside, but staying out here in the open felt even more dangerous. As I reached for the door handle, I froze. A handprint appeared on the passenger window. Not from the inside, from the outside. Tiny, water-soaked, forming right before my eyes. Another print appeared beside it. Then another. It was him. I couldn't see his face, but I could feel him, close, inches away, separated only by glass. His presence wasn't warm or gentle. It was cold and empty, like standing in the shadow of something that should not exist outside the lake. "Marin," I whispered through clenched teeth, "what do you want from me?" A voice, a child's voice, echoed faintly inside the car. Not outside, inside. "Come with us." My heart nearly stopped. I jerked my head around, expecting to see him sitting in the back seat, but the car was empty. The voice drifted through the air again, chilling each breath. "She's waiting for you." I threw the door open and stumbled out. I wasn't thinking clearly anymore. Maybe I wasn't thinking at all. Panic drove every step, and panic whispered that the only place with a lock and solid walls was the cabin. I ran. The sun dipped behind the tree line as I reached the porch, shadows stretching out across the lake. The cold grew instantly harsher, stabbing into my lungs with each breath. I slammed the cabin door behind me and locked it, then shoved a chair under the handle for good measure. Inside, the warmth from earlier had vanished. The air felt wet, heavy. I could hear faint dripping from somewhere deeper in the house, but the kitchen faucet wasn't running. No, the dripping wasn't coming from the sink. It was coming from the bedroom. Slow, rhythmic drops hitting the wooden floor. I didn't want to look. Every part of my brain screamed not to look, but something else pushed me forward, something like a pull, something like grief, not my own. When I stepped into the bedroom, the air tightened around me like a closing fist. Water pooled on the floor beneath the window. Drops fell steadily from the frame, though the glass wasn't cracked. It looked like the water was leaking through the wood itself, as if the lake had seeped into the cabin walls. Then I saw it, a handprint on the window, a woman's hand, larger than Toby's, fingers long and bone-like. Another print formed beside it, then another, each print pressing outwards as if she were climbing up from the inside of the lake and pushing her way into the room. My breath caught. She wasn't outside. Not anymore. The lights flickered. The temperature plunged. And then behind me, the floorboards creaked beneath a slow, deliberate step. I turned. Water dripped on the floor, and there she was. Marin stood in the doorway, her wet hair hanging in ropes, her gray skin stretched tight, her hollow eyes locked on mine with a desperate hunger. Her mouth opened in a silent plea. "Please, don't leave us again." I backed away, heart clawing at my chest, but she stepped forward, water spreading across the floor under her feet. "We're a family," she whispered. Her voice broke. "We can be whole again." Her hand reached out. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Only one thing mattered now. If she touched me, I knew she would never let me go.
Her hand hovered inches from my chest, droplets falling slowly from her fingertips, each drop freezing its moment it touched the wooden floor. I could feel the cold radiating from her, a cold deeper than anything the Minnesota winter had ever given me. It wasn't the cold of temperature, it was the cold of absence, the cold of something that no longer belonged to the world of breathing, moving, living things. "Marin," I whispered without meaning to. My voice trembled. I didn't speak her name out of empathy. I spoke it out of fear. Fear that if I didn't acknowledge her, she would take acknowledgement by force. Her eyes flickered, not with malice, not with rage, but with something worse. Recognition. "You came back," she whispered. I froze. "Came back?" She stepped closer, her movements stiff and unnatural, like joints that had been frozen in place for years being forced into motion again. Water pooled under each step. Her hair clung to her cheek in gray strings. Her voice cracked like wet cloth tearing. "Don't leave him alone again." My heart slammed against my ribs. She wasn't seeing me, not as me. She was seeing someone else. Someone she knew, someone who abandoned her, someone who let her drown, her husband. She thought I was him. "No," I whispered, stepping backward until my spine hit the wall. Her expression sharpened instantly, twisting into something agonized, confused, desperate. She tilted her head slowly, water sliding from her jawline. "You promised," she breathed. "You promised you'd keep him safe." My blood went cold. She was slipping deeper into memory, and memory didn't care who I actually was. Memory wanted repetition, resolution, replacement. She reached again. This time I dodged, stumbling toward the living room, slipping on the wet floor. She followed with a slow, dragging grace, her bare feet leaving dark marks across the wood. The cabin suddenly felt too small, walls leaning inward, floorboards groaning under the weight of something ancient and grieving. From the doorway behind her came another sound, a soft splash. Toby. The boys stepped into the cabin as if pushed by an unseen tide. Water dripped from his hair onto the floor in a soft patter. His vacant eyes stayed locked on me, unblinking, glassy, filled with the reflection of the lake instead of any human thought. He opened his mouth. A long, underwater gasp poured out, bubbles rising from nowhere, the sound of someone inhaling water instead of air. My stomach twisted. His thin arms lifted slowly, shaking with effort. He was reaching too. "Don't leave." The cabin felt suffocating now. The walls creaked violently, as if the entire structure leaned toward the lake. The windows fogged over, the lights flickered, casting their soaked forms in warped shadows across the ceiling. I backed up until the couch pressed into the back of my legs. I couldn't run past them. I couldn't get to the door. The lake beside the cabin seemed to pulse, pulling, calling. "We're a family," Marin whispered again, stepping closer. "Come home with us." The room twisted, and for a moment I wasn't in the cabin. I was on the lake, kneeling in a boat. A storm overhead, Toby crying, Marin screaming his name as the boat overturned. Hands clawing at the water, my lungs filling with cold. A memory, but not mine. Her memory forcing itself through me like a wave. I gasped and snapped back into the cabin, gasping for air. Marin stood inches from me, her face contorted with grief. "Please, don't make me search anymore." Her hand touched my arm. The cold hit instantly. Deep, violent, piercing. It felt like she reached through my skin and laid her palm directly on my bones. I screamed as the cold spread across my shoulder, down my arm, up my neck. My vision blurred, my knees buckled. Images flooded my head. Toby laughing on the dock, Marin brushing his hair, her husband rowing the boat that night, the storm rolling in, the panic when the waves hit. None of it belonged to me, and yet it felt like I had lived every second. She was pulling me into her story, pulling me into her family, erasing who I was, piece by piece, replacing it with who she wanted me to be. I ripped free from her grasp and stumbled toward the back of the cabin. The cold burned like fire. My entire left arm was numb, useless, limp at my side. Marin shrieked. The sound wasn't human. It was the lake itself, screaming through her mouth. The windows shattered outward, exploding into shards that flew across the room like frozen insects. Wind crashed in. Water slithered along the floor, spreading toward my feet. Toby appeared in the corner of the hallway, blocking the path to the bedroom. His small body dripped steadily, each drop echoing like a ticking clock. Marin lunged. I ducked, sprinting past the kitchen, slipping on the wet boards. Her fingers grazed my back, freezing the fabric instantly. I crashed into the back door, bursting into the night air. But the lake was waiting. The water churned violently, waves rising without wind, as if something beneath stirred restlessly, aware of what was slipping from its grasp. Marin stepped out of the cabin behind me, her form silhouetted in the doorway. Toby stood beside her, expression blank, water rolling down his face like tears. "You can't run," she whispered. "You belong with us. He belongs with us." I stumbled backward toward the tree line, breath coming fast and ragged. My left arm dangled uselessly. My legs shook. Marin took another step. The lake roared behind her. I turned and fled into the woods. Branches whipped against my face. The ground felt slippery, unstable, as if the earth itself tilted toward the lake.
I didn't know where I was running, only that every instinct screamed to put as much distance as possible between me and the thing wearing Marin's grief like a skin. But something followed. Not footsteps, not voices. A pulling, a dragging weight in my chest growing stronger the farther I ran, like invisible hands tugging me backward, urging me toward the water. My vision dimmed around the edges. My head spun. The branches ahead multiplied, doubling and tripling, as if the forest itself blurred. I realized with a cold bolt of terror, the lake wasn't behind me anymore. I couldn't hear the trees. I couldn't hear my footsteps. Only water. I stopped abruptly. The smell of pine was gone. Only dampness filled the air. I blinked. The forest dissolved. I stood at the shoreline again, right where I started. Toby stood a few feet away, staring, and behind him, rising from the lake with silent purpose, was Marin, closer now, reaching. Her voice drifted over the lake in a whisper that slid along my spine. "Come home." The water at my feet began to pull inward, dragging me toward the dark.
The suction at my feet strengthened with each passing second, subtle at first, then insistent, like the lake had wrapped invisible fingers around my ankles. I tried to step back, but the ground beneath me wasn't solid anymore. It moved with the rhythm of the water, softening the earth, pulling it apart grain by grain. The mud swallowed my heels. Toby stood at the shoreline, his hollow eyes reflecting fragments of moonlight. He tilted his head, almost curiously, like a child watching a toy he'd broken, unsure how, but fascinated by the result. Water dripped from his fingertips in slow, steady trails, each drop merging with the current tugging at me. Marin came closer, not walking, gliding. Her feet never touched the ground. She drifted forward as though carried by the breath of the lake. Her shoulders rose and fell with slow, unnatural movements. Her hair stuck to her face in tangled ropes. Her eyes were voids, not empty, full of memory, grief, hunger, need. They locked onto mine with a force that stole the breath from my lungs. "You came back," she whispered, voice trembling with fragile hope. "We can finally be together." I shook my head violently, the cold biting into my throat. "I'm not him," I managed to say. "I'm not your husband. I'm not the one who—" She raised her hand sharply, and the lake surged. Waves slapped against my knees, freezing pain shooting through my legs so fast I nearly collapsed. She didn't want explanations. She wanted a reunion, a replacement. Toby stepped closer, his small feet making no sound on the soaked ground. He reached out a hand toward me, tiny, trembling, waterlogged. "You won't leave me again," he whispered. The lake pulled harder. The mud swallowed me to mid-calf now. My heartbeat pounded so violently it hurt. I looked around desperately, but the forest behind me was gone, compressed into silhouettes that flickered like mirages. The cabin was nowhere to be seen. The entire world had collapsed into lake, water, cold, and the figures before me. "Marin," I gasped, "you're dead. He's dead. You have to let go." Her face twitched. A ripple of anguish flickered through her hollow features. "No," she whispered, voice cracking with anguish. "A mother doesn't let go. A mother finds her child." The waves surged again, and then I felt it. A deeper pull. Something far below the surface. Something older, stronger, hungrier than Marin herself. Something that had claimed her, twisted her grief, reshaped her memories into a trap for the living. It wanted me just as much as she did. I forced my hands into the mud, pushing, clawing, trying to break free. My fingers went numb instantly. The cold was no longer just temperature. It was something alive, crawling into my skin, clinging to my bones. Toby's face changed suddenly. For a brief second, just a flicker, his expression softened. His eyes, blank moments ago, filled with something almost human. Fear, sadness, confusion, as if the child he once was surfaced from beneath the water for a heartbeat. "Mama," he whispered, voice quivering. "I'm cold." Marin's expression twisted. Pain spread across her face like cracks through porcelain. "I'm here," she whispered back. "I'm here, baby." For a moment, only a moment, I saw the truth in her eyes. She didn't understand. She didn't fully grasp what she had become. She was trapped between memory and death, driven by love that had curdled into something monstrous. That moment was my only chance. I lunged sideways, wrenching one foot free from the mud with a sickening, tearing sensation. The cold tore at my skin like blades. I pushed off with everything I had left, dragging my body toward the tree line that flickered like a mirage. Marin screamed. The sound wasn't human. It was the lake breaking open. The water surged forward, crashing around my hips, pulling me violently backward. My legs buckled. The world spun. Toby moved swiftly, impossibly swiftly, his small hands reaching toward my throat. I twisted, barely dodging him. His fingers grazed my jaw, and the cold shot through my skull like an electric current. My vision dimmed. The world narrowed to darkness and water. "No," I choked. "No, no, no." I grabbed a branch sticking from the mud, yanking myself forward with a strength born only from terror. My shoulder screamed with pain. The lake pulled harder. Marin's hand brushed my back. "Don't leave me," she cried, her voice splintering. I forced myself one more step, then another. My legs trembled violently, but the mud loosened beneath me. The suction weakened. Something cracked in the distance. One sharp snap, like a tree branch splitting. It broke the trance. The tree line sharpened. The moonlight shifted. My senses flooded back. I stumbled forward with everything I had left, diving into the foliage. Branches tore at my face. Roots caught my feet. But the ground was solid here. Cold, but solid. I dragged myself deeper into the woods, collapsing behind a fallen log as the world spun violently around me. The lake roared behind me. Marin's scream echoed through the trees, a sound so full of grief it nearly tore the air apart. Then, silence. A long, cold silence. I lay there for what felt like hours, shaking uncontrollably, breath ragged, skin burning with frozen pain. When I finally crawled to my feet, the lake was quiet again, still, calm, as if nothing had happened. But the forest around me was different. Not dark, empty, no birds, no rustling, no wind. Nothing lived here anymore. I moved slowly, using the moonlight to guide me until the cabin came into view. Broken windows catching glints of silver. Front door hanging open like a mouth frozen mid-scream. Inside, water covered the floor. Footprints, large and small, led in circles, overlapping, fading, reappearing, then stopping. Right in front of the door. My suitcase lay open, drenched. My notebooks soaked through. The wooden horse Toby left behind was gone. The only thing left untouched was the table near the window. A single message was carved into the wood, the letters uneven, jagged, desperate. "Don't come back." I left the cabin before dawn. I didn't look at the lake. I didn't look at the footprints. I drove on bare rims until I reached the highway. I never returned to Whisper Lake. I never reported what happened. I never told anyone about Marin, about Toby, about the thing under the water that used grief like a lure. But sometimes, late at night, when my house gets too quiet, I hear dripping in the hallway.
and a small voice whispering, "Don't leave me again." The cold that follows is always the same. It smells like lake water, and it never, ever comes from the walls. It comes from behind me every time.